Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves. Today on the show, a quick Karl-Anthony Towns injury update according to Shams Charania. We'll do that first, and then some Wolves lineup combinations we need to see here in the unofficial second half of the season, plus the Wolves-Wizards preview for Thursday night. It's all upcoming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked on Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked on Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked on Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Happy Thursday, everybody. Happy Timberwolves game day after a couple days off, and actually 4 out of the last 5 off. The Wolves are back in action tonight to take on the Wizards. We'll preview that at the end of the show. Plenty to get to first, though. The very first thing, though, is a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, Locked On Wolves is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch the show on Locked On Sports Minnesota. That's a Roku app and an Amazon Fire TV app. You can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken, and that's with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. All right, a lot to talk about today. I do want to start with Karl-Anthony Towns, though. I spent most of the show on Wednesday actually talking about Cat, the Wolves needing to figure out how to reintegrate him, reasons why I think it may be less complicated, especially now with Mike Conley. Actually, even though there's, of course, was more Cat D'Lo familiarity, I think Mike Conley will have a good hand, a strong hand in reintegrating Karl-Anthony Towns eventually. However, the latest reporting from Shams Charania suggests that perhaps it will be even further away than we maybe thought it would be. Shams appeared on his FanDuel TV or on FanDuel TV. He did a segment. This actually wasn't on Twitter. I don't think he put it in an article anywhere. But Shams Charania, of course, of Stadium and The Athletic, said that the Timberwolves are expecting, or they're hopeful, I think was the word he used, that Towns will be ready to return during their last 10 to 15 games of the season. Now, if that sounds like it's forever away, it's not, because remember, the season's almost 3/4 of the way over, even though we're not yet to the All-Star break. It's this weekend, right? So it's maybe not as terrible as you'd think, but still, the last 10 to 15 games of the season, working backwards, do the math. Here, I'll do it real quick. That would be like the second week of March-ish, right? So that's still 3 weeks from now, and the All-Star break will be over. The first game after the break is February 24th, so maybe he starts practicing after the All-Star break. That's 1 week of practice, gets us into March, and then that's probably the last 20 games. So, maybe that's 2 weeks of practice, right? So if that's the case, I think Wolves fans in general were hopeful it could be right after the break, although as far as we know, he's not practicing yet. He's been, light workouts, I think, on the court before road games. This road trip is what it sounded like. So maybe he starts practicing right after the break, gets 10 to 14 days of practice in. This is just me guessing. But that last 10 to 15 game of the season timeline for Shams, that puts us second, maybe third week of March. And it's actually maybe not so coincidentally, right when the schedule lightens up a little, you get the Bulls, you get the Raptors, you get the Knicks in succession. I'm talking March 17th, 18th, 20th. Atlanta on the 22nd, and then it kind of ramps back up with a really tough Western Conference stretch the final 2 weeks of the regular season. Golden State at Sacramento, at Phoenix, home for the Lakers, which could be really big depending on how the Lakers and their new acquisitions are doing at that point. Then Portland, Brooklyn, and then you finish with San Antonio and New Orleans, which who knows with Zion and the latest news with his setback with the hamstring injury, the last game of the season against the Pelicans could be pretty interesting. So all that to say, disappointing news to be sure. It's of course better than, there doesn't appear that there was any sort of a setback or anything, but it I guess continues to be odd that the Wolves are being so cagey about this whole thing. Like, just say he's got a grade 3 sprain or whatever, or strain, I should say. And just say he's out for another couple of weeks, because now we're just playing this game of every little just shred of information we're hanging on to and hoping that it means something. And, Shams is generally reliable. It wasn't Shams that had the initial 3 to 4 or 4 to 6 week report. I think that was or I know it was Adrian Wojnarowski at ESPN that had said 4 to 6 weeks. Shams now is saying, I mean, I'm inferring this based on his range of the last 10 to 15 games is, 3 weeks from now still. So not ideal. But that's the latest news. All right. Next, let's talk about some Timberwolves lineup combos. And I want to spend the bulk of the show today doing that. We did some 2-man lineup stuff earlier this week. I want to focus on a couple of players, and they're really what I would call plus-minus all-stars for Minnesota. Yes, one of them is Jordan McLaughlin. We'll get to him next. I want to start with Kyle Anderson, though. Actually, no. Let me flip that on the fly here. Let's go with Jordan McLaughlin. Because I think the Jordan McLaughlin effect is it's clear, right? Everybody knows he's a plus-minus all-star, or I should say a net rating all-star and an on-off all-star is actually probably more accurate. His plus-minuses are always good too. But like, for instance, if you just look at his on-off numbers and you look at the team as a whole, he's easily the best player, has the best on-off numbers of anybody else. Now, on-off, there's more context to it, right? Because it also depends on who is on the court when he's off the court, right? But either way, Jordan McLaughlin has an on-court plus-minus per 100 possessions at Basketball Reference of a plus 11. The next best player is Matt Ryan at a plus 6.5. Then Luka Garza at a plus 5.3. The only other players that are better than 1 point positive are Jaden McDaniels, Kyle Anderson. That's it. Anthony Edwards, Jalen Noel, Taurean Prince are all less than a point positive. Everyone else is a negative. That includes Karl-Anthony Towns. That, of course, includes D'Lo. That includes Rudy Gobert is a very slight negative. So that's all great, right? But if we look at his net rating, Jordan McLaughlin, his net rating is a plus 1.5. The team has a net rating of plus 11.15. Much better. A plus 11.15 with Jordan McLaughlin on the floor. With no Jordan McLaughlin, the entire season, the Timberwolves are a minus 1.46. So they're a negative team so far this season when Jordan McLaughlin is on the bench or injured, which he has been for a good majority of the season. With Jordan McLaughlin, just Jordan McLaughlin, again, his on-off, in 356 minutes played this year, the Timberwolves have a net rating of 11.15 and an offensive rating of just a shade below 118, which is fantastic. Now, what I think is most interesting about Jordan McLaughlin's net rating is if you, I'm doing this at pbpstats.com, so play-by-play-stats.com. If you plug Anthony Edwards into the I don't know, search bar or whatever. So you're taking McLaughlin and Edwards together. With McLaughlin on the floor and no Anthony Edwards, McLaughlin's on-off drops to, in 150 minutes that Jordan McLaughlin has played with no Anthony Edwards, a plus 0.03. So effectively neutral. So Jordan McLaughlin on the floor, the Wolves are 11.1, a plus 11.15. Take Edwards out of the equation. So McLaughlin, no Edwards, which is just a little less than half of McLaughlin's minutes so far this year. And it drops to basically net neutral. But McLaughlin and Edwards together, you guessed it, the rest of those minutes, 150 minutes, McLaughlin, no Edwards, 206 minutes with the two of them together on the floor. And the team's up plus 18.93. So a 19 net rating with Edwards and McLaughlin on the floor together. Their offensive rating together is a 124, which is just insane. The defensive rating is a very good 105. So the McLaughlin effect, to be clear, he's a good player, right? But it's really the McLaughlin plus Edwards effect is the most impressive thing here, is the chemistry that those two have, the effectiveness that they have. Actually, the offensive rating is obviously much better with Ant on the floor. The defensive rating is better with him on the floor as well, with McLaughlin and Edwards together. So it's really fascinating too. And I want to get into Edwards alone here in a minute. That'll be next segment. I want to talk a little bit about Anthony Edwards. But I think it's important to point out the impact that Edwards has with Jordan McLaughlin on the floor. And I think there's certainly defensively, right? The defensive rating drops from a 109 with McLaughlin and no Edwards to a 105, which is a good thing when Edwards is on the floor with McLaughlin, because obviously you're adding more length, athleticism, etc. Edwards is a good on-ball defender. But the offense, when McLaughlin's on the floor, more often he's initiating offense. If Edwards was on the floor with D'Lo, Edwards a lot of times would initiate. McLaughlin initiates a lot when Edwards is on the floor. But even if he doesn't, McLaughlin is so good as a secondary basically a second reaction in the half court, like, hey, I got to do something quick. McLaughlin's so good there. He's also very good in transition as a decision maker and also turning defense to offense. McLaughlin is a thief defensively. He's a solid defensive player, but he also picks his spots and generates turnovers. So Ant is getting easier baskets in the half court as well. The Timberwolves 3-point shooting as a team with those two on the floor together is 38.4% as a team with McLaughlin and Edwards on the floor. I think the ball moves better offensively. I think you have multiple legit ball handling options with McLaughlin and Edwards, more so than when, say, it's Noel and Edwards, or more so than when it's in the past been D'Lo and Edwards. I think that the low usage nature of McLaughlin fits with Edwards really well. But all that to say, for as good as McLaughlin is, I think there's some questions as to, like, once the minutes limit is the minutes restriction is removed for J-Mac, what's the ceiling on how far can you push McLaughlin minutes wise before there's some diminishing returns? Because I don't know that he's a legit starting point guard. At some point, the effectiveness might wane a little bit because of his size limitations and some defensive limitations. And again, this is not Jordan McLaughlin slander. It's getting a player to play their role and stay within themselves. Can you push that? If Conley needs some rest here and there as we get closer to the playoffs, or needs a night off, and McLaughlin doesn't have a minutes restriction, can you push McLaughlin to 30 minutes a game? Do these on-off numbers stay similar? Or is it not wholly dependent, but largely dependent on Anthony Edwards' minutes and that pairing? It's a really interesting question that the Timberwolves will hopefully push on a little bit. I'd like to see McLaughlin get some expanded minutes, and perhaps my concerns are validated, and perhaps I'm wrong, and McLaughlin can be a starting point guard in this league. Either way, the on-off numbers for McLaughlin and the net rating for McLaughlin, especially McLaughlin plus Edwards, continue to be extremely strong. Next, I want to focus in on Kyle Anderson, and Edwards is a big part of that conversation too, and the impact that Kyle Anderson has had as a similar player, albeit in a different role than Jordan McLaughlin, and the impact he has on the floor. So I want to do that here next. First, though, let's talk about our title sponsors of today's show, and that is, of course, our friends over at FanDuel. The midway point of the NBA season is here, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scorers and threes drained. My favorite bets this week all have to do with All-Star Weekend. 3-point contest. I did very well with that last year. I picked Karl-Anthony Towns, hit the longest odds. It was great. I haven't actually looked closely at the field this year and what the odds are at the moment, but that's where I would look on Saturday. Slam dunk contest is a bit of a crapshoot. Skills is fun. Like, just, take a look at all of them and pick a favorite. I think it's a ton of fun. And then also Sunday, of course, the big game with Anthony Edwards. FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets. When you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, let's talk some about Kyle Anderson. Kyle Anderson has obviously had an incredible impact on the Timberwolves this year. There's no question that his basketball acumen, his ability to do really almost anything on the floor, and Chris Finch has called him multiple times a Swiss Army knife, right? Like that. Kyle Anderson has had a very measurable impact on the Timberwolves this season, right? Like, by almost any measure, he's been a very, very positive player for Minnesota. And on-off numbers and net rating are a really great way to kind of, I guess, prove that, right? So let's do this. Let's talk about the differences between the Rudy Anderson minutes and the Rudy Ant minutes, and then all three together. And actually, the first thing that kind of made me take a look at this a bit deeper was this article at The Ringer from a couple of weeks ago, which now is becoming already, I don't know, the Freezing Cold Takes Twitter account. Like, I think we're there now with this just 3 weeks later. But Michael Pena, formerly of Sports Illustrated, is at The Ringer now and wrote an article with the headline, I'm sure you've read it, "Are the Wolves stunting Anthony Edwards' growth?" Which is funny. It's a funny article. So go check that out on the Ringer if you want to laugh or if you want to hate read something. But he talks a little bit about the Timberwolves lineups. Well, talks a lot about their lineups with and without Anthony Edwards, and he talks about how Gobert and Anderson together are cramping the floor for Anthony Edwards. Yeah, spacing is a legitimate thing, right? I'm not laughing at that. But well, anyway, I don't want to digress too much here. So then he mentions when Edwards plays without Gobert or Anderson. When Edwards is on the floor with no Rudy Gobert, no Kyle Anderson, Pena says Minnesota's offense becomes historically efficient. So I wanted to dig into this a bit more. And actually, let's do. So that lineup that he mentions is just hilarious. Let's see. I have it pulled up here. There we go. Edwards, Anderson, and Gobert together. So you look at that lineup, and he talks about it being historically efficient with no Anderson and no Gobert on the floor and just Edwards. Well, sure. The net rating, or I'm sorry, the offensive rating for an Edwards lineup with no Anderson and no Gobert is a plus 7.1. That's the net rating. The offensive rating is a 122. That's really, really, really good, right? In 552 minutes. So it's a big sample, a decently sized sample as well. Edwards with no Anderson, no Gobert. But the defensive rating of that lineup is still a 115. So your net rating is only a plus 7, which is good. But it's just the offense that's historically good, right? So look at this. Kyle Anderson and Rudy Gobert with no Anthony Edwards are a plus 121 offensively and have a 21.8 net rating because the defense is so good. It's admittedly a much smaller sample. It's 121 minutes that they've been on the floor with Anthony Edwards. But the net rating is significantly better together. If you take Kyle Anderson out and it's just Anthony Edwards and Kyle Anderson, Anthony Edwards and Rudy Gobert, which is a much bigger sample because Anderson wasn't in the lineup to start the year, right? So Edwards and Gobert, and he's also had the back spasms, missed a ton of time. Edwards and Gobert with no Anderson have played 678 minutes, and they're a minus 4.1 net rating. So simultaneously here, we can see the Anderson effect, right? Because Edwards and Gobert together are a minus 4 net rating. Add Anderson to the group, and this becomes a plus 4.7 group. That's direct, obviously, the Anderson effect, right? But also, you take Ant off the floor, and Anderson and Rudy together are 21.8 because they're so good defensively. So the Anderson effect is very real, obviously. But also, great offense, bad defense with the Edwards lineup with no Rudy and Anderson, right? So it all makes sense. There's nothing here that's really surprising. And it's not just a confirmation bias. These numbers really bear out what we think we're watching, right? Any lineup with Anthony Edwards is extremely dangerous and very, very potent offensively. But it really depends on who he's on the floor with defensively to cover for some of the, the gambling, the off-ball issues that Edwards still has defensively. But when he's on the floor with other really good defenders, again, the Edwards-Anderson minutes, Edwards-Anderson-Gobert minutes, it's still defensively, that's a good team. It's a 109 defensive rating, a plus 4.7 net rating. So the Anderson effect is very real, but I think it all depends a little bit more on who you're surrounding Anthony Edwards with. So going back to last segment, talking about Jordan McLaughlin with Anthony Edwards and that being a plus 18 point, whatever it was, that's insane. So really what we ought to be doing is just looking at every lineup with Anthony Edwards and realizing just how important it is who you're surrounding Anthony Edwards with. Who can the Wolves put on the floor next to Edwards that augment what he does so well? And that's dominate the ball and score at all three levels offensively. And defensively, it's on ball. You want him guarding the ball as much as possible and then having high IQ length around him if he's guarding the ball. So Jaden McDaniels is getting there in terms of being an off-ball defender and has good defensive instincts, but just needs a little more experience. Obviously, Kyle Anderson and Rudy Gobert are great examples of that. But it's also why Jalen Noel lineups struggle, right? Because Noel's, he's long, but he's a little bit smaller, and he doesn't have the defensive skill level of some of these other guys. Now, together, they're still a positive on the floor together. But the defensive rating isn't nearly what it is with some other players. You put Edwards with Taurean Prince, the defensive rating is also good. The players that the Timberwolves choose to play with Anthony Edwards are going to be huge for his development down the stretch of this season. And that, again, it's not groundbreaking, but that's what digging into these stats. Yes, this is a Jordan McLaughlin effect. Yes, there's a Kyle Anderson effect, but overall of it, it's an Anthony Edwards effect. Which lineups is Ant most successful with? which players can succeed best. Not saying they're better without Ant on the floor, but which players can hold their own, can help carry the team when Ant is getting his rest for those, 12 to 15 minutes per game. Which players can hold the water, right? And that's what Chris Finch has to figure out down the stretch this season. All right, let's close the show by talking Wolves Wizards. It's the final game before the All-Star break for the Wolves. So we're going to preview that here next. All right, Timberwolves return home after a 4-game road trip, I think, to take on the Wizards on Thursday night at Target Center. It's the final game before the break, and there'll be 8 days between games before the Wolves' next contest. That's next Friday. They're at home again next Friday. But Thursday against the Wizards back at Target Center. The first time the Wolves and Wizards played each other was, of course, the infamous Karl-Anthony Towns injury game. It was game number 21 of the season back on November 28th, just after Thanksgiving. Karl-Anthony Towns hurts his calf in the third quarter. Timberwolves were already losing by double figures at that point. They got blitzed early in this game by the Wizards. The Wizards offense was just fantastic. The Wolves defense was horrific early. So a 19-point game at halftime. Towns gets hurt in the third quarter, and it was just awful. For the Wolves, Anthony Edwards had 29 points. He got to the line 11 times. That was kind of the Wolves offense, but he also turned it over 7 times. Jalen Noel had 23 points off the bench in a really efficient performance on just 13 shots. D'Lo had 17 and 5, but he was 1 of 7 outside the arc, 6 of 15 shooting. Rudy had 19 and 7 and didn't miss a shot. But again, like, Towns got hurt. They had to start Austin Rivers in this game because Kyle Anderson came off the bench. What happened? Oh, Jaden McDaniels. This is like that weird stretch where I think he was sick or something, where he missed 2 or 3 games. So there was no McDaniels in this game for the Wolves. It was just a weird game and a very, really depressing game with the Towns injury. They got taken to the woodshed by Kristaps Porzingis. Porzingis had 41 points on 18 shots in this game. It was just one of the more efficient performances you'll ever see. 12 of 18 shooting from the floor. So a strong 67% from the floor. 6 of 10 on three-pointers and a perfect 11 of 11 at the line for Kristaps Porzingis. The Timberwolves actually got to the line 42 times in this game. And looking at what the Wizards, do and don't do well, they don't actually foul that often on the season. They're 6th best in the league in avoiding fouls and opponent free throw rate. The thing that is an outlier from this game last time around, or I should say another thing on top of that, the Wolves turned it over 18 times in this game, only 7 by Washington. And the Wizards are 29th in opponent turnover rate. Only one team turns their opponents over less than the Wizards in the entire league. The Wolves had 18 miscues against Washington back in late November. So the Wizards gave up a ton of free throws and turned the Wolves over a bunch. For the most part, they don't foul that much. And they also don't turn you over that much. So the last time around, there were a lot of kind of screwy things about this game. No McDaniels, Towns gets hurt, and the turnover thing and the free throw thing. So there's a lot about this last game that just feels fluky. Something that really isn't fluky, though, is Kristaps Porzingis playing well against the Wolves. He pretty much has always done that. Going back to last season against the Wolves, Porzingis averaged in 2 games 19 points, 5.5 rebounds, shot 50% from the floor, and 43% from 3. That's just what Kristaps Porzingis does against the Wolves. And so, no, it wouldn't be a shock if he did something similar again. 2 years ago against the Wolves, he averaged 25 points and 9 rebounds on 52% shooting in 3 games against the Wolves. This is when he was at the Mavs 2 years ago. I'll say it again. 25 points, 9 rebounds per game, 52% from the field, 52% from 3-point range 2 years ago. And then last year, 19 and 5 with the 40% from 3. And then, of course, what he did this year, 41 points and 18 shots. Remember what Edwards said, it was last year, about Porzingis, is that he was the most difficult rim protector in the league to deal with, even tougher than Rudy Gobert. Porzingis added 3 blocks in this last game and 2 steals against the Wolves. Basically, everybody on the Wizards had 2 steals when the Wolves turned it over 18 times. So all that to say, Porzingis is going to be a handful, and Gobert played in that game. I mean, Gobert played in that game against the Wizards. He had 19 and 7 with 1 block in 29 minutes. So Gobert will have to contend with the Wizards. Now the Wizards will have to contend with Jaden McDaniels. McDaniels will surely be checking, I would imagine, Kyle Kuzma in this game, unless they just straight put him on Bradley Beal, which is possible. Maybe they try and put, I mean, it would make more sense, I think, to put McDaniels on Kuzma and put Edwards on Beal and just kind of see what happens. But I should also point out the Wizards are better than I think a lot of people expected them to be this year. They're a couple games under 500. They're 27-30, but their Pythagorean record is 3 games better than that, or 2 games better than that, I guess, which suggests they've had some bad luck. They're pretty middle of the pack in almost every category. They're 15th in offense, 16th in defense. They're middle of the pack in pace, free throw rate, 3-point rate, turnover rate, like basically everything. They're pretty middle of the pack. And they've got a couple really good players, right? Like Bradley Beal is obviously fantastic. Kristaps Porzingis has been good this year. Kyle Kuzma has been really good this year. They've got 3 guys that are all averaging 21 plus per game. Kuzma at 21.5 per game on 46% shooting. Beal 23 per game on 52% from the floor, and Porzingis 23 game on 49% from the floor. And you know, other than some Beal injuries earlier this year, this is a relatively healthy team as well. So not a easy game by any means going into the All-Star break. And we've seen the Wolves kind of alternate wins and losses. Of course, the big win on Monday. So against Dallas. So we'll see how they come into this game, what kind of focus they come in with. Hopefully, you know, getting some good practice in the last couple of days. Hopefully they're able to focus in this last game before the All-Star break. It's tough for everybody to focus in the last game before the break. Hopefully it's tougher on the Wizards than Minnesota. But I would say my keys for this one are, try your best to get Porzingis in foul trouble. The big man depth, you know, Daniel Gafford's a good defender, but like the big man depth just isn't quite as formidable there for Washington. So try and get Porzingis into foul trouble and, you know, put a body on him, make him work. The Wizards are a decent rebounding team. The Wolves actually out-rebounded them in the last time they played them. Try to defend the 3-point line against Beal and Porzingis and Kuzma. Easier said than done. But if the Wolves play solid, if McDaniels and Edwards are good defensively, don't get into foul trouble, this is, of course, a winnable game for Minnesota. I just think it's some fluky stuff happened last time. They got behind the 8 ball early. Towns got hurt. This is the thing that worries me the most is everything I said a minute ago about this being the last game before the break coming off of a win. We'll see how if Mike Conley can help steady this team, a couple days of practice, a couple days at home can maybe calm them down. But if the Wolves play solid, it's a game they should win at home on Thursday night. All right, we'll, of course, do the post-game podcast on Friday. I don't believe we'll be doing a postcast live on Locked On Minnesota on YouTube as we usually do after the game. We will. So, again, no postcast heading into the All-Star break, but there will be a Friday post-game podcast that'll post early Friday morning. So be sure to tune in for that. And we'll do regular shows throughout the break next week, Monday through Friday. So Monday's show will be all about All-Star weekend and specifically the All-Star game, the main event on Sunday when Anthony Edwards will be in the game and will, of course, be trying to win MVP as he said he wants to do. So we'll talk about all that on Monday's show. But first, Wolves Wizards, we'll talk about it on the postgame pod Friday. A big thank you to those of you that do make Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, it's free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on Locked On Sports Minnesota on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. Download the app today on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken. And that's with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Now, make your second listen the Locked On Game to Game NBA podcast. Every moment, every top performance, and every result. Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA. Available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.